About 12 months ago, Goldman Sachs were in the press, and they were there because a group of young junior staff had decided that enough was enough, and they were going to talk openly about the working conditions in Goldman Sachs and what it was like working 95, 100-hour weeks, and crucially, the impact that had on their mental health and their well-being. Now, this had a huge impact on the industry, not just within Goldman Sachs, but it also came at a time where there was a lot of increase of demand for those services. And so all of the big consultancy firms were trying to attract more staff and especially get the younger talent into their organizations. So they had a couple of things to think about. How do we respond to this press around the working conditions and particularly the impact on our younger, more junior members of staff? And how do we do that at a time when we're trying to attract more of them and the best of them into our business? Now, all of the industry did respond, and the major companies like JP Morgan, etc., all raised the salaries for their junior members of staff. The last to do this was Goldman Sachs. But when they did it, they actually made the biggest raise out of all of them. And my question is that a good strategy? So I'm going to examine three elements to this. Number one, does increasing money lead to an increase in well-being? Number two, what impact does it have to give all junior members a raise at the same time? And number three, given the amount of money they were already earning before the raise, what impact does a raise actually have on their well-being? Okay, so does more money make us happier and improve our well-being? So let's assume that you're on £50,000 a year and then you're given a £10,000 a year increase. What kind of things happen next? Well, you might review the types of holidays you're going on and think, I can spend a bit more on the next one. Or you might have been waiting for a new car, so you might decide then to go and buy a nicer car than you expected. You might shop at a fancier shop for your clothes, or you may even buy a bigger house. The key point is you'll adjust your lifestyle. Now, initially, when you make that first adjustment, your happiness and wellness will probably increase. You'll enjoy being in the new car or having a nicer house or going on the nicer holidays. But very quickly, that will become your new norm. And once that happens, your level of wellness will revert back to the previous baseline that you had. And this is called the hedonic adaptation trap. So what that shows is your pay will increase your happiness and well-being in the short term, but that will revert back to normal over time. Now let's consider if we all get the same rise in our income, what impact does that have on our well-being? So let's take an example. Let's assume that we are all project managers and we're all working in the same company and we're all given a pay rise that's exactly the same. Think about how that feels. Now compare that to the same situation, but just you get a pay rise. Does that feel different? And lastly, think about that same situation, but you all get different pay rises, but yours is the lowest of all the pay rises. How does that feel? What this shows is how our brains work as social comparative creatures. We always compare ourselves to our peers, to those around us, to those in our immediate environment. There was a really interesting study by an economist called Richard Easterlin. And what Richard did was he looked at a country level and explored what would happen if all of the country felt a similar benefit in living standards and income and the impact on the correlation with happiness over that same period of time. Now, there's actually a real example of this. In Japan, over about a 30-year period, there was a 5 times increase in their living standards as a country over that time frame. And Richard Easterlin looked at the impact of happiness and living standards and wellness within that same period. What Richard expected to find was that as the living standards increased and the income increased over that 30-year period, he would see a similar increase or at least something comparable in terms of the happiness and well-being of the people that lived in Japan at that time. But he didn't. There was no impact. So what I find really interesting about this is that our happiness is often very directly correlated to our relative standing within our peer groups or people that we know within our immediate environment. And you'll have seen studies or headlines or stories about people earning insane money in London, for example, but feeling very competitive and unfairly treated relative to their peers, even though they're in the top 1% of earners within the whole country. When you give a rise to somebody in a company, their feeling of happiness will often be determined by the variance they see between their raise and their peers' level of salary and any increase they may have got. So number 3, do we always feel the same when we're given a raise? And this is particularly in the context of the Goldman Sachs story. The junior staff at Goldman Sachs, at the time this story was released, were on about $85,000 per year. Now with the raise, this took them to $110,000. So how much of an impact does 25k a year have on our wellness as employees? So let's make this a UK specific one and think of an example. Let's assume we're on the national average salary in the UK, which is £38,000 per year, and you're given a £25,000 a year increase. I think my math suggests that's £63,000 your new income is. Let's think about that one initially, and how would you feel with that increase? Then let's look at being on £85,000 per year and going up £25,000 a year to £110,000. That's your new salary. How does that feel in comparison? Now, the key thing is, of course, that you don't feel the same. Whatever your comparison is in your mind, those two contexts, those two situations are vastly different, and therefore your feelings and your emotions and your happiness and well-being in response to the same amount raised, £25,000, is very, very different. It simply means, as you'd expect, that we are a lot more sensitive as human beings to salary increases when we're earning around the kind of national average in comparison to being in that kind of top 1% earner in the £100,000 and getting the same level of pay increase at that time. The impact on your well-being and your wellness will be vastly different, even though the pay increase is the same amount. So if you're Goldman Sachs and you're thinking, was this a good idea? Did we make a good decision to increase all of our junior staff salaries by the same amount at the same time? Then it's easy to look at those 3 points that we've just discussed. So the hedonic adaptation trap, they're going to feel the same after an initial spike. The Easterlin paradox, because they've all been given the same amount of raise, they'll feel a bit less special as a result of the rise. And third, the diminishing marginal rate of utility. The fact they're already earning a lot means the rise and the impact of the rise on their happiness and well-being is reduced. Those would all suggest that actually it's not an effective strategy. But that depends on what the purpose was of the increase in salary at the start. Were Goldman Sachs genuinely looking to have a positive impact on their employee wellness? If that was a genuine strategy to increase the level of well-being, then an increase in salary alone is not the way to achieve that. So that wouldn't work. But actually, if their strategy was just to remain competitive against the Morgan Stanleys, etc., and to continue to attract the best talent and keep their best young junior staff, then maybe that will be successful, because you have to remember the profile of the people that are going into these types of positions. One thing that Goldman Sachs in that industry does really well, maybe not intentionally, is that they do give out a very clear impression of what it's like to work there. The culture that you expect to walk into, which is heavily publicized, as we've already seen in this example, is one of very grueling, hard working hours. But maybe that is the attraction for people. Maybe some people go there because they want that experience and they want that to fast track them and give them that real edge in the marketplace, do that for a few years and then go on to do other things afterwards and get that lifestyle balance and that positive well-being impact at a different time of their career when they've got different things in their lives, like, I don't know, families or children, etc., that mean they need to make that adjustment. So maybe this was the right strategy, and maybe Goldman Sachs said, we're not going to try and positively impact well-being. We know the type of profile of candidates that we need to be successful in the company. We'll continue with that culture that we have. We'll just make sure we're rewarding people more financially for doing so and making sure that they're making a decision to come to Goldman Sachs rather than their competitors, because money will be a much bigger factor in that decision than well-being will be for the profile of candidates we need for the role. So I hope you found that useful. I'd love any comments, any thoughts on this topic and any examples that you have. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, then please like and subscribe. Thanks.